There are places that don't announce their danger. Nothing jumps out, nothing moves. The air sits still, and if someone asked you to explain what feels wrong, you couldn't. You'd only know one thing with absolute certainty: you need to leave. For thousands of years, people separated by deserts, oceans, and centuries have described the exact same experience: a sudden awareness. A feeling of being noticed, not watched the way eyes watch, but acknowledged. And here's what makes it truly unsettling: they all responded the same way. They didn't claim to be attacked. They didn't see monsters. They simply left and never returned. Across cultures that never met, sharing no myths or traditions, they used the same word for whatever caused that feeling. This isn't a story about creatures hiding in the dark or proving whether Jinn exist. This is about something far older and harder to dismiss: why humans learned to fear certain places long before they understood them, and why that fear still activates today, even when we tell ourselves it shouldn't. To understand this, you have to go back to a time when darkness was absolute, isolation was unavoidable, and leaving at the right moment meant the difference between surviving and vanishing. Picture a lone caravan guard standing watch around 800 BC, deep in the Arabian Peninsula. The rest of the caravan sleeps. The wind shifts. A sound carries farther than it should. He knows the desert well enough to recognize when something feels wrong, even if he can't explain why. He doesn't run, he doesn't call out, he simply waits until dawn and never camps there again. This wasn't paranoia. This was survival. Travelers crossing the Arabian Peninsula as early as 1000 BC described voices calling their names from places where no one stood. Sailors navigating the Red Sea reported footsteps moving across empty decks in the middle of the night. Explorers entering cave systems in North Africa spoke of panic rising without warning, as if they'd crossed an unseen boundary they couldn't retreat from. In those environments, every sound mattered. Every movement demanded explanation. When something felt present but couldn't be seen, belief became the only language available to describe it. These stories don't usually end with attacks or proof. Most of them don't end at all, they simply stop. And for centuries, people across the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia have used the same name for whatever they believed they encountered. Long before Jinn appeared in movies or folklore, they existed as part of everyday belief. In Islamic tradition, which began in the 7th century in present-day Saudi Arabia, Jinn aren't metaphors. They're described as real beings, a separate creation from humans, neither angels nor demons, but something else entirely. This distinction matters. Jinn aren't fallen angels, and they're not embodiments of pure evil. They possess free will, just like humans. Some are good, some are harmful. Most are indifferent. That moral complexity is one reason the belief endured Jinn were never simplified into villains. According to belief, Jinn live alongside us in a world we cannot normally perceive, intersecting with ours only under specific conditions and in specific places. This belief isn't fringe, and it didn't fade with time. Millions of people today across Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Morocco, Iraq, Pakistan, and Indonesia still grow up understanding Jinn as part of how the world works, not as superstition, but as context. Jinn were never created to entertain. They were created to explain the parts of the world that once had no answers. The earliest discussions of Jinn predate Islam by centuries. In pre-Islamic Arabia, roughly between 1000 BC, life was shaped by isolation, long-distance travel, and exposure to vast environments that could turn hostile without warning. Caravan routes stretched across what is now Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Jordan, and Oman. Travelers often moved at night to avoid the heat, guided only by stars, landmarks, and memory. In those conditions, invisible beings were believed to inhabit deserts, ruins, storms, and lonely places, not because people wanted something to fear, but because those environments produced experiences that demanded explanation. Sudden madness, disorientation, even bursts of creativity were attributed to unseen presences. Pre-Islamic poets believed their words sometimes came from something outside themselves, not metaphorically but literally, as if inspiration had been placed inside them. These ideas weren't considered strange. They were accepted as reality. These beliefs were passed down orally, not as horror tales but as survival knowledge. Avoid certain places at night. Speak carefully when alone. Respect spaces not meant for long stays. In a world without scientific language, belief became the framework for understanding risk. When Islam emerged around 610, these beliefs weren't erased, they were formalized. Jinn were acknowledged as a distinct category of beings, created before humans, formed from smokeless fire, living in a parallel unseen world. Between roughly 800 and 1200, during what historians call the Islamic Golden Age, Jinn belief didn't disappear under scholarship. It was debated, discussed, and analyzed. In cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo, scholars openly discussed the nature of unseen beings alongside mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Some argued that what people called possession might be illness. Others believed unseen beings and the human mind weren't mutually exclusive explanations. Education didn't erase belief, it refined it. Jinn were placed at the edges of understanding, where certainty breaks down. That placement explains why the belief survived science. Jinn were never used to explain everything, they explained specific things. Fear in isolation, disorientation in hostile environments, and the feeling of being observed when no observer could be found. As scientific understanding expanded, those edge cases remained. Jinn belief didn't compete with science. It occupied what science couldn't fully erase. Across centuries, one detail never changed: where Jinn were believed to appear. Not because these places were dangerous in obvious ways, but because they stripped humans of reference. In deserts, there are no edges. At sea, there's no ground. In caves, there's no sky. In ruins, there's no present. Each environment removes something the human mind relies on to feel oriented. Distance becomes unreliable. Sound loses direction. Time stretches or collapses, and in that absence, awareness turns inward. Jinn belief didn't arise because people saw things. It arose because people felt seen in places where being seen made no sense. But there's another detail that rarely gets spoken aloud. Fear doesn't arrive immediately. It creeps in slowly, often after a moment of stillness, after the traveler stops walking, after the sailor pauses to listen, after the explorer stands silently in the dark. Silence becomes the trigger. Human perception depends on feedback. Footsteps confirm ground, echoes confirm space, voices confirm presence. When that feedback disappears, the mind becomes alert in a way that's difficult to describe. Attention sharpens, thoughts narrow, the body prepares without instruction. This is where many Jinn stories truly begin, not with movement, but with the realization that the environment is responding to your awareness. Sounds that stop when you stop, air that feels heavier when you focus, fear that intensifies the moment you acknowledge it. In Jinn belief, this is the most dangerous moment, not because something attacks, but because attention itself is believed to invite attention in return. That idea appears again and again across cultures. Don't stare too long, don't call out, don't investigate. Curiosity isn't punished, lingering is. People were warned not to react emotionally, not to panic, not to challenge. The safest response was neutrality, to leave calmly, to deny the moment's significance. This may sound symbolic, but for people who lived without rescue, without communication, without maps, this rule was practical. Panic leads to mistakes. Fear narrows judgment. Survival required restraint. Jinn belief encoded that restraint as wisdom. It taught people when to disengage. Only after this understanding settled did people begin describing specific locations again. Deserts were among the first. Endless open land, no shelter, no landmarks, no help if something went wrong. In regions like the Rub al-Khali in Saudi Arabia, the Sahara in North Africa, and the Syrian desert, travelers described voices carried on the wind, figures standing impossibly far away, and overwhelming fear, with no visible cause. Imagine a traveler in the 1st century, walking alone at night, hearing his name spoken clearly from behind him, only to turn and find nothing there. The fear doesn't come from the sound itself, it comes from the implication that whatever made it knew who he was. The desert doesn't attack, it disorients, and belief rushed in to explain what disorientation felt like. At sea, vulnerability took another form. Sailors navigating trade routes between East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and South Asia as early as the 8th century recorded footsteps on empty decks, sounds from below when no one was there, and shadows moving against lantern light. Picture a night watchman on a wooden ship around the year 900, lantern in hand, hearing movement below deck that stops the moment he listens for it. The fear isn't chaos, it's restraint. Something responding. Caves intensified this further. In the Atlas Mountains, the Levant, and Arabia, people warned against entering underground spaces without purpose. Inside caves, sound collapses. Depth disappears. Time feels distorted. Modern explorers still describe panic rising without explanation. Many describe fear peaking not inside the cave, but after leaving it. In Jinn belief, this delayed fear isn't imagination, it's recognition. Ruins followed the same pattern. Abandoned villages, collapsed forts, and empty dwellings across North Africa and the Middle East were avoided after sunset. They represented interruption, something ended there, but not everything left. Alongside these locations came rules. Avoid drawing attention, avoid whistling at night, avoid entering abandoned places alone, speak respectfully, announce yourself. These rules were passed quietly across generations. Even skeptics followed them, not because they believed, but because the rules worked. When encounters were described, they were subtle. A voice calling a name, footsteps without a source, movement just beyond vision, fear without a cause. What made these experiences frightening wasn't danger, it was intention. Humans are wired to detect awareness. Fear spikes when something feels directed. Jinn belief encoded that sensation. The fear wasn't that something was there, it was that it seemed to notice you. Many of the stories that survive do so not because they were recorded carefully, but because they were repeated quietly. One account passed down through families in southern Arabia describes a shepherd watching over his flock near a rocky outcrop roughly 2,000 years ago. As the sun fell, he heard footsteps moving along the stones behind him, slow and deliberate. When he stopped walking, the footsteps stopped. When he moved again, they followed. He never saw anything. He gathered his animals and left before night fully fell. For the rest of his life, he avoided that place. A sailor's account from the early medieval period tells of a night watchman aboard a trading vessel crossing warm, open waters. He heard movement below deck and leaned closer to listen. The sound moved away from him. When he stepped back, it stopped entirely. He later said the fear came not from the sound, but from the sense that it was responding. Cave encounters follow the same structure. A group of young men entering a limestone cave in North Africa felt an overwhelming urge to leave without explanation. As they exited, one heard what sounded like whispered speech deeper within the cave. None of them returned. The cave was described not as dangerous, but occupied. Modern hikers in Morocco, Jordan, and parts of Saudi Arabia describe sudden dread with no visible cause. Some report that acknowledging the fear internally makes it stronger. Others say it fades once they turn back. Recognition, in Jinn belief, is a form of attention. Comment, seen below if you believe in the Jinn. There are stories tied to abandoned houses, families entering long empty stone homes to retrieve materials, hear sounds that grow closer without revealing a source. They leave and never return. The materials remain behind. Some accounts describe nothing outward at all. A traveler resting near a dry well wakes with the certainty that he's being observed. No sound, no movement, just awareness. He leaves before dawn and avoids wells after sunset for the rest of his life. What unites these stories is restraint. There are no attacks, no proof, just a boundary crossed and respected. And then comes silence. Most stories end there. People don't return. They don't speak. They don't explain. Many stay silent out of fear of ridicule. Others stay silent because naming the experience gives it weight. In the modern world, belief adapted. Medical literature from the late 20th century onward documents cases where dissociation or altered consciousness is interpreted as Jinn possession, particularly in the Middle East, South Asia, and North Africa. Clinicians acknowledge that belief shapes experience. Medicine doesn't confirm Jinn, but it confirms something older and harder to dismiss. The human mind responds to belief as if it were real, because to the body, experience matters more than explanation. When Jinn entered Western culture in the 18th and 19th centuries, fear was softened. The genie replaced the Jinn. Autonomy became servitude. Warning became entertainment. The genie is what happens when fear is made safe. Even modern institutions encountered the same limits. During the Cold War, particularly between the 1950s and 1970s, governments studied isolation, sensory deprivation, and fear. The same environments produced the same experiences. In the West, they were called UFO encounters. Elsewhere, Jinn. The experience didn't change. The language did. Beliefs don't survive for centuries because they're dramatic. They survive because they're useful. Jinn explained danger before science could. They warned people where not to linger. They gave rules to fear. This was never about proving Jinn exist. It was about understanding why people kept believing in them. Whether Jinn are entities, experiences, or the names given to moments of vulnerability, the fear attached to them is real, and fear shared across centuries rarely comes from nothing. Some places were never meant to feel empty. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of all. That in a world mapped by satellites and illuminated by cities, there are still spaces where people lower their voices instinctively. Places where conversation stops, where footsteps feel too loud, where the air itself seems to listen. Because no matter how much the world changes, humans haven't stopped recognizing that feeling, the moment when curiosity turns into caution, when the body knows something the mind can't explain yet, when the safest decision isn't to investigate, but to leave. Jinn stories don't tell us what's hiding in the dark. They tell us why humans learn to respect it. If you've ever felt that shift, that quiet warning that something isn't meant for you, then you already understand why these stories survived. And if stories like this matter to you, stories where history, belief, and fear overlap, consider subscribing, because there are many more places like this, many more stories that end in silence, and some of them are still being lived.